Um, Hello, everyone. To everyone in the room and to those who are joining us online, first and foremost, I would like to welcome you to the Global Green Growth Week 2003. The Global Green Growth Week is a knowledge flagship annual event organized by the Global Green Growth Institute, GGGI. And this year's motto is fast tracking transformative climate action. And the event aims to share knowledge of scalable solutions that can make significant contributions to global efforts to address the climate crisis. We do have the whole week planned with various sessions. There is an official opening ceremony of the Global Green Growth Week planned later today at 6 p.m. Korean Standard Time. But we are starting a bit early with the very first session of the week. And before we start with the session, we would like to share a welcoming video remark by our President and Chair, Mr. Ban Ki-moon.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the 7th Annual Global Green Growth Week. I speak to you today with a sense of urgency because our one and only planet is facing a crisis of unprecedented proportions. The theme for this year, fast-tracking transformative climate action, underscores the grave and urgent situation. For many years, I have been emphasizing a simple truth about the climate crisis. There is no plan B because there is no planet B either. The opportunity to save the planet is not for the distant future. Now is the time. We need everyone to join and help tackle the climate crisis, and the policies and solutions need to meet the urgency and severity with boldness and innovativeness. The year 2023 was marked yet again with record-breaking temperatures and severe weather events. To keep global temperatures below the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold and avert the worst, we must act swiftly and boldly. Therefore, I'm proud that Global Green Growth Week brings together policymakers, thought leaders, investors, and innovators from the public and private sectors from all over the globe to discuss solutions to the climate crisis. And I'm also excited that there will be a special spotlight on young people and their pivotal role in a greener future. Much like the least developed countries and small island developing states, young people will be the most impacted despite having contributed to the problems the least. They therefore have every right to contribute to the solutions, and their creativity and passion will be invaluable assets. With the conclusion of the first global stocktake, discussions to operationalize loss and damage and other important issues, this year's COP28, which is just weeks away, will be critically important, and I hope the Global Green Growth Week will prove to be a helpful stepping stone to build momentum, hone ideas, and much more. The challenges before us are immense, but so is our collective potential. Let us seize this moment and work together to fast-track transformative climate action. Together, we can secure a safer, greener, and more sustainable world for ourselves and for generations to come. I wish you my best wishes for very productive discussions. Thank you.
Great. Now, moving on to the first session, addressing loss and damage on the ground, a global perspective. In this session, we will hear lessons learned and best practices on how to address climate-related losses and damages on the ground from a global perspective to a country perspective, as well as at the project level, from different practitioners and researchers in this field. Loss and damage gained significant traction during the COP27, leading to the agreement to establish a L&D fund. There are still a lot of clarity that is needed on how the fund will be operated, but one thing is clear. It is evident that climate-related loss and damage is an inevitable reality for nations worldwide, particularly for the most climate vulnerable developing countries, despite their limited responsibility for the climate crisis. We have a great line of speakers planned for the session. I will introduce each speaker as we move along the agenda. And to start the session, I would like to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Achala Abesinghe, who leads the Asia Regional Program at the Global Green Growth Institute, GGI. She is an international climate change and sustainable development expert with over 20 years of global experience. And in 2015, as the legal, technical, and strategic advisor to the LDC groups in the UNFCCC, she played a key role in negotiating the Paris Agreement on climate change. She's also the lead author on the 5th assessment report of the IPCC. And here's Dr. Achala to give her opening remarks and to introduce GGI's work on loss and damage.
Thank you, Shivnes. Good morning, everyone. I was told that I could actually present sitting down, but I feel too small when I sit down, so I wanted to stand up. Welcome from me too, those who are in the room as well as joining online for the first session of the Global Green Growth Week. We are absolutely honored to have this session as the first session, and also it's my greatest pleasure to welcome you all for this session. So thank you very much for joining us today. As Shivnes mentioned, this session is about global perspectives on loss and damage, and we do have a great set of speakers joining us. But before I go to my first slide, let me say, in addition to loss and damage due to climate impacts is a stark reminder of the reality that we are facing. It is also a stark reminder of the situation that we are facing because of the inaction in terms of climate change and the actions that we need to take. And it is a stark reminder that the true cost of inaction far exceeds the price of prevention. Next slide, please. And as Shivnes mentioned, I am going to focus on the GGGI's work on loss and damage. But before I go to that, let me go through the history a little bit to remind everybody how the global community has come this far in addressing loss and damage. The issue received quite a lot of attention in last year and during the Paris Agreement negotiations as well. But actually, this has been an issue that has been championing, promoting, and being addressed at on the ground by many countries that we work in, particularly the small island developing states and the least developed countries that are the poorest in the world. And this discussion started in 1991 with the Association of Small Island Developing States. And then we went to 2007, where we had the consideration of loss and damage, particularly means to address loss and damage, first introduced in Bali at the COP. And then 2013, I'm sure you've all heard of Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, where we focused on enhancing knowledge and understanding, as well as strengthening action and support and facilitating cooperation. And then came the most important event for the matter, which was the Paris Agreement on climate change. And this, under the Paris Agreement on climate change, for the first time in the legal agreement history, we have an article in a multilateral treaty that addresses loss and damage, or that encourages countries to address loss and damage. And then in 2017, we launched the Fiji Clearinghouse for Risk Transfer. And then 2019, the parties to the Climate Change Convention established the Santiago Network. And then 2022, the agreement to establish a fund to respond to loss and damage. And I've been in most of these COPs, actually, since 2006, I attended the Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC. So until last year, I have proactively participated in most of these negotiations, particularly supporting the least developed countries. Now, I think this community, again, knows what we are talking about when it comes to loss and damage. There are two major events we look into in terms of what creates loss and damage: slow onset events as well as rapid onset events. And rapid onset events, extreme events, it's easy for us to identify. It's easy for us to talk about losses and damages related to, for example, floods, heat waves, droughts, etc. But when it comes to slow onset events like increasing temperatures, increasing sea level rise, glacial retreat, loss of biodiversity, that's where the complexity comes in terms of data and information that is needed to truly address loss and damage. And in terms of types of losses and damages, there are two major areas that the countries consider: economic losses, such as loss of income, physical assets, as well as non-economic losses, such as loss of life, loss of health, as well as loss of territory, etc. And again, when it comes to real action to address loss and damage, addressing non-economic losses seems to be pretty challenging compared to addressing economic losses. And now what we as an organization do, or we are planning to do in terms of addressing loss and damage, there are a lot of organizations working on this area. So we really want to add value, and we want to have a good discussion on what is that added value from GGGI East. As my colleagues would say, or we always say, our organization is about growth and supporting our countries to economically grow, but in a more greener, resilient, and inclusive manner. And how do we address loss and damage? In that vision that we have is the consideration that we are bringing to this discussion. And we do have three key pillars that we work on. First one being identification of gaps and knowledge generation. And here we focus on doing research and analysis. We are focusing on key entry points into existing national programs. So rather than creating new programs, we want to really work with the governments to create, identify entry points into existing programs. We do knowledge sharing and collaboration among our member countries. We do have 48 members as of last week. So, and we bring in that knowledge sharing and collaboration platform for our countries. And we also have an ongoing program to support the least developed countries group through support research, as well as bringing in evidence, as well as capacity strengthening and negotiations support to least developed countries group in the UNFCCC process. And the second pillar that we focus on is on building partnerships, particularly focusing on advocacy for increased support for loss and damage, engaging wider range of stakeholders, as well as building South-South cooperation. And then the third pillar is operationalization of loss and damage. This is an area that countries are actually trying to figure out what this actually means. How do we operationalize? What is the project would look like on the ground to address loss and damage? How do we integrate loss and damage in national development strategies, establishing national or regional loss and damage funds, developing and implementing innovative solutions, for example, supporting SMEs to address loss and damage after disaster hits, or providing technical assistance and strengthening institutional structure are the areas that we focus on in terms of operationalizing loss and damage. Just quickly to introduce two approaches that we are taking, one in the Africa and the other one in Asia. Africa Regional Program for Loss and Damage covers, again, support to MSMEs, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises impacted by loss and damage, particularly focusing on leveraging ongoing support on policies, mechanisms, as well as strategies to enhance capacity to address loss and damage. And we've already started discussing and establishing partnerships with African Union as well as African Risk Capacity for that matter, and WFP as well. And then Asia program, again, focuses on supporting SMEs, and we focus on developing and supplementing approaches to humanitarian aid that focuses on SMEs and their economic challenges to achieve developed status through industrialization and sustained economic growth. And the key areas that we focus on include research, policies and institutions, financing, as well as capacity building. And financing here, I want to mention that we want to focus on supporting SMEs recover from climate-induced loss through funding, grants, loans, and resilience measures complementing government insurance. So it's not just insurance, but to also complement the insurance. And that brings me to my last slide to say thank you very much. And I want to say as the end kind of statement to mention here that loss and damage for many years has been the unwritten story, an untold story of the poorest and the most vulnerable. And the losses and damages happen on the ground, but not many people cared about those poorest and the most vulnerable. And now the things are changing, actually, with the attention from the global community to establish a fund, and now discussions around what that fund could cover, the scope, as well as who would host the fund. The attention has shifted much more at the global level as well as at national and community level to make this matter, take this matter very, very seriously. With that, I will stop here. Thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Achala, for your opening remarks. For our next speaker, we were supposed to have Professor Salimul Huq, but I just knew yesterday that he's feeling unwell and will not be joining. But ICAD has arranged for another speaker to speak on behalf of Professor Salimul Huq. So our next speaker, Ms. Nusrat Naushin, is the research officer and core coordinator of the loss and damage program in ICAD. And her works mostly lies in climate negotiations, locally led adaptations, advocacy, and narrative building for loss and damage. Ms. Nusrat.
Thank you so much, Shivnas. I'll just quickly share my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
And not the full screen.
Yeah. Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Nusrat Naushin. I'm currently working as the program coordinator for loss and damage in the International Center for Climate Change and Development. Our center is heavily engaged with the loss and damage work over the past couple of years under the supervision of Dr. Salimul Haq, and we have a big team working on different domains, be it rather research or engaging nationally or regionally or even globally in the loss and damage negotiations, as well as strengthening the research and evidence base for loss and damage. And we have a dedicated team working with loss and damage discourse in the UNFCCC domain, in which we have been actively participating and giving inputs since the past couple of years. So I'll just quickly move more into the global arena of the work that we have engaged in. Dr. Achala has already covered a lot of the history of loss and damage, but I just wanted to take a deeper dive into how the process and the delays in the process essentially. So this is kind of the UNFCCC timeline of the progress of loss and damage over the years. And as you can see, ever since the time when the UNFCCC was formed, the small islands have been already asking for some support for loss and damage to be a part of the convention when it was being talked over and formed, since they were the ones who were already feeling the impacts of sea level rise and slow onset events. And then fast forward to 2007 in COP13, the first loss and damage work program was being discussed over, which was finally established in COP16 in 2010. So again, a 3-year delay ever since the start of the discussion of a potential work program to it being actually established. And then again, the next big progress was encountered in 2013 in COP19, where the first political vehicle to carry forward the work on loss and damage was formed, which was through the Warsaw International Mechanism. It started out with an executive committee of about 20 members, with about 10 annex countries, which the developed countries call themselves annex countries, and the 10 non-annex countries, which are essentially the developing countries, with 5 separate working groups, which included the Task Force on Displacement, the Non-Economic Losses group, then the CRM, which is the Comprehensive Risk Management group, the Slow Onset Event Expert group, and the Action and Support Expert group. And just wanted to pinpoint that among the 5 working groups, the 4 of them are more or less working, but the action and support, under which the technical support or the loss and damage finances fall under, that is the one which is dormant even now. And hopefully with the new since last COP, we're gaining to see some more momentum into it. Finally, in COP21 in 2015, loss and damage gained an official spot in the UNFCCC process under the establishment of the Article 8 of the Paris Agreement, which talks about averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, but with a very specific caveat of no mention of liability or compensation in the loss and damage discourse. This was, I want to call out names at this point, that this was particularly pinpointed by the United States, which would not come into agreement or consensus with the rest of the groups unless this was put under this particular agreement. So eventually the developing countries gave over and they agreed to this particular clause. After that, again, years of review and research from the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism, no concrete intervention had come up, while there were already existing gaps in climate finance in terms of adaptation finance, with the pledges that were already made, but it was not being met on the ground. And finally, in COP25, the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage was established, which was initially thought of to serve as an implementing arm, which will catalyze technical assistance of relevant organizations, bodies, networks, experts, in order to implement local, national, regional kind of work on loss and damage. But again, 3 more COPs have gone by, and the only progress in the SNLD work frame was in terms of defining the functions of the Santiago Network. And finally, in COP26, there was a huge pressure from the developing countries for establishing a Glasgow, that's what it was called back then, a Glasgow loss and damage finance facility, to act as a finance arm to address loss and damage. However, in the very last day of COP, the decision text was changed from a finance facility to a Glasgow dialogue, which will run again for 3 more years to discuss whether they should establish a fund and to flesh out how a fund would look like. And after this discontentment during COP26, all the different actors and civil society organizations lobbied extremely hard over the 1 year time. And finally, at COP27, they pressured enough for the parties and the different negotiators to finally establish a loss and damage fund at COP27. The COP agreed for broad parameters and established a separate committee, which is called the Transitional Committee, to spend the entirety of 2023 to sort out the details of how to operationalize such a fund at COP28. So this again was thanks to the immense pressure from the different civil society groups, including youth, academicians, researchers, NGOs, think tanks, everyone, thanks to them, that this was set up. But again, over the past 1 year, the progress, I'll move on to that as to how the progress has unfolded. So this is kind of like the latest updates on the negotiations. So there were 2 major UNFCCC held events over this 1 year. That is, every year at during the mid-year, the intersessionals, it's called the subsidiary bodies meeting, take place in Bonn, where the UNFCCC Secretariat resides. So the Bonn Climate Conference happened again this year in June, and this is where the Glasgow Dialogue unfolds every year. So the first Glasgow Dialogue was in June 2022, and this year in June 2023, the second Glasgow Dialogue took place. So before moving on to Glasgow Dialogue, there was some momentum in the SNLD discourse. So after 2 weeks of open and closed door negotiations during the subsidiary bodies meeting this June, the only agenda that was discussed over and over and again that could not be agreed was on who would be the potential host for the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage to host the Secretariat. And only, in fact, it's interesting because only 2 proposals have come through in this particular area. So one was the Caribbean Development Bank, another was UNDRR, the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Framework. So these are the only 2 proposals that have come forth, and both the organizations have in their proposal have their strengths and weakness, and thus again no consensus was reached because a lot of the developing countries wanted CDB, whereas the developed countries pushed for UNDRR because of their essentially internal motives. And finally, it was decided that the decision of who will be the host of the SNLD would be taken at COP28 to begin the work, hopefully potentially from early 2024. Moving on to the Glasgow Dialogue. So it was a 3-day dialogue which took place with a similar modality of last year, in which the first day was, and the last day was essentially a plenary where countries were presenting their own statements. But the second day was more of a dialogue. So again, from our point of view, it should be more, the entirety of the 3 days should be dialogue and not go into plenary format for majority of the 3 days, right? So the main concerns raised during the Glasgow Dialogue were about how the fund should not just fund the urgent requirements, but also have a programmatic, medium and long-term phase. And the fund should definitely not increase the debt burden of the developing countries. So these were some of the issues that came again and again, that these are the things that should not be included in the fund, and it should be more flexible and fit for purpose. So these were some of the updates from the Bonn Climate Conference. Moving on to the transitional committee meetings. So again, as I mentioned, that it was a year-long process. They came up with 4 transitional committee meetings and 2 workshops that have already been conducted this year to agree on how to operationalize the fund. And some I would just like to present some of the latest updates because the transitional committee meeting, the fourth one, TC4 meeting has just ended, and two of our colleagues has already been there to represent CSOs from ECAD. And so the latest updates is that they again, after TC4, they should already come up with some solutions and some set of recommendations to present to COP. But they have again not come to a consensus on a number of issues, and a number of things are still pending. So the developed countries are pushing to have World Bank as a host for the loss and damage fund. And this is because they want kind of like the total control over who receives the funds and who don't. And the World Bank, in fact, and this has come up from the developing countries' perspective, that the World Bank has about 17% of overhead cost, which they will pool from the loss and damage fund to pay salaries of their employees of the World Bank. And this is unacceptable. And in fact, last year, the World Bank spent approximately about 2.7 billion USD in order to fund fossil fuel projects. And besides, the business model used by World Bank also includes the loan and debt structures. Hence, no country can have direct access from the World Bank and again be stuck through the intermediary cycle, for example, using the MDBs in order to access funding. So in terms of eligibility, another thing that came up, that developed countries only want to fund the small island states and the LDCs, but there are many more vulnerable countries and developing countries. For example, into 2022, in fact, Pakistan has a loss of about 40 billion USD because of the floods, the massive floods that took place there. But they don't fall under the category of small islands or LDCs. So that means they will not be eligible to access the funds. So the CSOs continuously reiterated the need for a standalone fund, which is fit for purpose and follows the principles of equity, the CBDR, climate justice. But again, calling out names that the USA don't want to include these principles in the loss and damage fund. And this stance is further actually being backed up by the European Union. And the mandate of the TC was to deliver, as I mentioned, a set of recommendations to COP to take a final decision, but no recommendations was made leading up to COP28, despite having 4 meetings and 2 workshops. And now they're planning to add another transitional committee meeting, which they're calling TC5, earlier half of November, right before COP, to come up with a set of consensus decisions. So again, this, as you can see, the delays that have happened ever since the beginning of the UNFCCC on the loss and damage discourse, and again, even over the last 1 year, the way that how people are not coming in agreement in how to operationalize a fund, which is essentially very simple because of course there are many complexities included there, but the motive should be clear and the willingness to pay should be there. Earlier this year, our center, ECAD, along with Stockholm Environment Institute and German Watch, together we have come up with a number of rigorous studies and reports on how to operationalize the loss and damage fund. And we actually led a report based on the recipient perspective. So we had a number of regional focus groups in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and small islands, where we divided those focus group discussions into breakout rooms according to actor type, because we tried to include national governments, local NGOs, as well as some local representatives as much as we could, in order to get their perspective of how they think, what are the needs on the ground, what are the kind of access barriers that they face, and what their solutions are, or how they think the loss and damage fund could look like, which would actually help them and not, prescribe according to what we think. So these were kind of like the set of principles that we came up with. And kind of, the approaches on which the Loss and Damage Fund could prioritize their interventions. So I'll add the links of the reports into the chat box so that everyone can take a look. I know I'm running out of time. I'm sorry. I just want to mention this one last slide. So essentially, these are some of the work that we are engaged in from our center. So as you can see, I mentioned the UNFCCC work that we have in our center, but again, we have a number of our main focus is on research and capacity building. So our research agenda particularly focuses on framing of loss and damage to include a continuum between adaptation, loss and damage, and DRR. And one of our biggest flagship research work is on how to evaluate non-economic loss and damage. And again, our research focus is national base. As you can see that we're trying to establish a national mechanism on loss and damage. We're doing this work with Germanwatch. We also have an LDC in-country work where we're working with a number of LDC least developed countries. We have this network of universities called the LDC University Consortium on Climate Change, where we're working with them in order to come up with a good strategy, LDC-wide strategy. Again, we conduct a number of training and capacity building workshops. The newest two domains that we have added is on climate displacement and youth. We're trying to establish some platforms so that we can form the essential networks and gain their insights. And, together we can work towards, again, during COP27, as the main push was from the civil society. We're hoping to do something similar this year. So that's all from my end. If there are any questions, I'll take it after, I guess. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Ms. Nusrat, I don't know if you could hear the round of applause in the room. But thank you for giving us the overview of where we stand in terms of L&D negotiations and where we will go at this year's COP. To those who are joining online, please feel free to share your questions in the chat. We have a Q&A session planned towards the end of the session. We will try to address your questions there then. Moving on to the next speaker, we were supposed to have a speaker from one of the leading nations in terms of loss and damage works, the country that kind of started the whole process from Vanuatu, Florence Iatu, who is the national focal point to the UNFCCC, and from the Ministry of Climate Change. However, we heard that Vanuatu is on red alert because of a Category 2 cyclone, and I think she's having trouble joining this session. I hope that everything is well in Vanuatu. Let's see, maybe she'll be able to join a bit later on. So we'll move on with the next speaker, Mr. Aslam Pervaiz, who is the Deputy Executive Director of Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, ADPC. Mr. Aslam has substantial fieldwork experience from more than 15 countries, working with national and subnational work program development and practical understanding of disaster risk management systems and climate change issues in international. And he will be providing an overview of the works of ADPC. Mr. Aslam.
Thank you very much. My height is also not that good. So thank you very much. First of all, I am really privileged to visit GGI for the first time in the headquarters here. My name is Aslam Pervaiz and I live in Bangkok. Those who have been visiting Bangkok for the last couple of decades or maybe in the last couple of years, you may have noticed that the air quality in Bangkok really has deteriorated substantially. The victims, particularly because of air pollution and the
heat. The latest study we just carried out in terms of the impact on the health is quite huge, particularly in terms of the mental health. At the same time, last week, Bangkok or Thailand celebrated this traditional vegetable week. In this week, generally people are encouraged to eat a lot of vegetable. And you may have noticed in the news that the government actually put a restriction that do not increase the price of vegetable during this time. But the reality is that the prices of vegetables has gone really, really up. While the government asked me not to pay, but who actually will compensate the farmers of the losses that they are having in terms of the production? And this is exactly what I think Achila mentioned in terms of the non-economic losses that we over the period of time has seen. My presentation in two parts, I will just explain a little bit from my organization's perspective, how we have been over the last 3 decades looking at extreme climate events and helping the countries in terms of building climate resilience. And I will also invite my colleague, Dr. Seneca, especially speaking in terms of how we are addressing loss and damage. Without going into any details of the loss and damage, we know that this is a reality. We hope that by the COP28, a better understanding that how this fund will be operationalized comes up, and we all are eagerly waiting because the demands in the countries are that they really, really would like to have this modality in place. From ADPC side, how we actually looking at climate resilience, both from the short-term climate weather events to the long-term gradual changes such as sea level rise and desertification. And coming back from again Thailand, what we have seen over the period of time, one of the major reasons for increasing the prices are also because of the sea level rise and the salinization that has happened. For the last 38 years, Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, some of you may know the organization, but just for your introduction, we are an international organization working primarily on disaster preparedness activities. Climate resilience is one of the important thematic area, but way back in 1990, ADPC has been engaged with the countries in Asia and Pacific in terms of looking at the long-term and short-term impact of extreme weather events. And since 1990s until now, a lot of emphasis has been to utilize the science, utilize the data for better prediction, better anticipatory actions, and which is now what we currently looking at, that how best for loss and damage we actually build capacities in the government so that they can benefit from the scientific knowledge, but at the same time use this one for improving the lives of the people, and particularly the vulnerable people, particularly the people with less resources. And this is where the story started. Currently, we do have a number of programs from an extreme climate events, but very specific to loss and damage. As in the morning in my discussions with our colleagues in GGI, we are very cautious at this moment because we are really looking at what the country's requirements are and where the country's ownership is on this particular issue. We know, and I have been visiting a number of countries, I also realized that while this discussion on loss and damage is advancing, and the discussions in terms of who would actually own the loss and damage fund, how it will be channelized, but back in country, I think the confusion still lies that how best the countries will get benefited. In terms of our engagement in these particular processes, while we fully endorse and be part of the global frameworks, and my colleague will also explain that particularly under the UNFCCC, we have been in terms of a number of working committees, particularly on this both economic and non-economic loss and damages. But the major work that we do at ADPC is to promote regional and South-South and transboundary cooperation together with institutions like Mekong River Commission or institutions in Indonesia. We really see a lot of these work, how these activities in ASEAN actually gets into the member countries. We also work at the national and the local level. We do not work directly with the communities, but in the last 30 years, for example, a number of work of ADPC in terms of looking at extreme climate events are related to establishing of climate field school. If you Google it, particularly for Indonesia and Philippines, that way back in 2000, a number of climate field schools were established where information of early warning, how they actually can use that information to adjust their farming thing. And this actually has now gone into having these climate field schools by the government department itself. And this is where I think ADPC has made a significant contribution in terms of climate change related issues. But let me just flip it from the subject of loss and damage to damage and loss. This is where we actually started way back in 2001 when this Gujarat earthquake in India took place together with World Bank and all. So we have been traditionally looking at post-disaster recovery and reconstruction by utilizing data that what are the damages and how you better estimate losses. While we have been doing it, the most focus for us has been to empowering the communities and strengthening the resilience. But over the period of time, with the increase of climate related events, we actually now addressing this whole issue of losses and damage from a comprehensive climate risk management perspective. And we are utilizing a lot of emerging technologies and tools to address that, to particularly empowering the communities across the different risk landscape. May I now invite Dr. Seneca to quickly update in the work that we are doing on loss and damage.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Aslam. So let's try to understand what ASEAN Disaster Preparedness Center ADPC has been doing on loss and damage, or to estimate losses and damages. Thanks, Dr. Achala, as well as Dr. Nasrut, for unfolding the story of this, UNFCCC. And now we have come to a sort of like situation where whether we could have this, the loss and damage fund, which she was mentioning. There's a risk of like, having this, maybe the World Bank would like to take that up, and then maybe the parties or the countries, probably they are not so happy to do so, because they are having like, they are asking 17% that, the overhead or something like that. So this diagram shows you the general sort of like, perspective or structure of comprehensive climate risk management, or we can put it in that way, like, comprehensive risk management. This is actually from a GIZ, where we had some sort of engagement to conduct a series of trainings and workshops, in particular on loss and damage. So in this, the training where we had this, the regional ones, South Asia as well as Southeast Asia and the Pacific. So we split it into three categories. The one is like, VIP. So the very senior officials, we conducted a 1.5 hours to 2 hour session. So for them to sort of like, aware, we were trying to aware of this issue. And then we also had another 3-day training on digital TOT, as well as a digital training for the practitioners, both, of course, the Environment Ministry or even disaster management organization, as well as the sectoral one. So the idea is like, for once they like, we provided sort of training, and when they try to institutionalize, so then there should be a sort of like, strong buy-in from the ministry senior officials. That was the reason that we had this, VIP seminar. So that was one of the events that the activities that we did, like, under this, the loss and damage. And in addition to that, ADPC has been engaged in developing the tool to estimate losses and damages. So way back in 2013 or 14, so we were able to get some funds from Asia Pacific Network, where we work with other universities, for example, Deakin University in Australia. So develop the methodology, a non-econometric methodology, and for estimation, economic as well as non-economic losses due to floods in agriculture sector on farmers. So there we address both economic as well as non-economic losses. In addition to that, if you see this, the generic, the presentation here in this diagram, so starts with risk assessment. That's the key to understand risks. Then we did it very extensive risk assessment in countries by ADPC. So it is something when it comes to risk assessment, of course, you need to do hazard assessment, collecting exposure data, and putting all of it together to get the risks. And after identifying risks, of course, that helps you to estimate the losses and damage because the impacts. So this is the story that, with ADPC we have been doing just before starting this, the losses and damage. But this is really helpful getting to the next level, meaning that, when finding options, of course, there are so many options, as you can see here from this diagram. So the globally, of course, mitigation options are there, but we are ADPC, we have been mostly concentration or, working on adaptation. So of course, when it comes to adaptation or disaster risk reduction, you can do certain activities up to certain levels. So there are some limits for adaptation, soft limits as well as hard limits. So beyond which there will be the risk we call residual risk. This is where that we are now discussing about addressing losses and damages. So there could be some ways and means to do it, risk transferring, insurance. So then for which actually maybe countries are still struggling. So that's why the UNFCCC will see through this WIM. So they are planning to set up the loss and damage fund. So the next slide. Yeah, sorry. So this is kind of global perspective as well as regional perspective, as well as the same story that we have been discussing so far. And so this slide shows that what we have done with this GIS. So the training modules that we provided through this GIS training, you can see that the basics, international laws, as well as the risk assessment methodologies, of course, towards estimation of losses and damage. I think that's all from my end. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have heard the global overview of the negotiation process. We have heard of capacity building activities conducted by ADPC. We are now moving to actually carrying out projects on the ground and working with communities to address loss and damage. So for that, we are glad to have our next speaker, Mr. Ashish Barua, who is working for Bangladesh's most affected community in climate hotspots for Helvetas Swiss Intercooperation. He looks at his work with the lens of justice, bringing the people's voice from the ground and places it on the table of critical stakeholders to hold them accountable for their actions. Here to share his experiences of best practices in carrying out projects on the ground, Mr. Ashish Barua from Helvetas.
Thank you, Shivan. So can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
And also the slides, huh?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So good morning all from Bangladesh. And
Mr.
from the
Ashish, we
Yes.
can see the presenters mode, so we can also see your node in case if that is intended.
Okay, does it work now?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay, good. Great, thank you. So good morning from Bangladesh. And from the people on the ground, actually, as Shivan already mentioned, I always speak for the people and work for the people on the ground. Okay. So as the whole discussion on loss and damage, that global framework, strategies, dialogues, discussions, all are already said. So let's straightforward jump to the ground, actually what we are doing and what is our experiences for last 1 year. So as you can see a photograph on the screen, so I'd like to draw your attention here. This is a photograph actually from Sundarban areas. That's in the Bay of Bengal. The photograph was taken during dry season 2 years back. So now probably you can imagine the scenario, right? As our president chair Ban Ki-moon also mentioned about record-breaking temperatures. And in Bangladesh, we are experiencing record-breaking high tide during every full and new moon, year by year. So what do you feel that, does the community really exist here? Maybe you're not, right? I hope that I'm speaking to the human being here who will not ask me or the community that, hey, how much contribution comes from the climate change, okay? So, okay, so deep feelings, let's try to dig down a little more, okay? So we are working in Bangladesh. As you see, we talk about the Bay of Bengal, the coastal areas, and our projects actually are implemented further down at the southwest of Bangladesh, which is obviously disaster-prone area. The people on the ground experience cyclone, tidal surge, saline intrusion, high tide. That's a regular phenomenon and regular experiences there. So the way we debate on loss and damage, that's not a new element for them. That has been happening since long, long years, and it has become part of their everyday life. Well, so as I mentioned that we would straightly jump into the actions, actually, what we are doing on the ground. So we have started when we're designing these loss and damage actions on the ground. So we have started the program actually with the funding support from CJRF, Climate Justice Resilience Fund, and the fund comes from the Scottish government. Probably most of you know that's the first ever institutional funding, which was declared immediately during the actually COP26 in Glasgow. So with that fund, when we started our planning, we also are struggling actually how to define that economic loss and damage actions, how to draw a line between adaptation and others. So at first stage, we started actually challenging ourselves. So not necessarily going on the field with our concepts, theories, and academic framework, rather than listen to the community. What is their thought? How they interpret loss and damages? Actually, how did they see loss and damages in their life? So you see in the photograph, around 50% of the people are from the community we have engaged in our planning workshop. We intensively worked for 3 days and tried to define actually how the loss and damage they see in their everyday life. Just let me give one example. We are analyzing one situation just based on one photograph of a woman who was carrying a pitcher of water. When all the project people mentioned it's an adaptation in the context of saline intrusion and water crisis, the community raised their hands, hey, this is not adaptation, this is loss and damage. So how? Because they were sharing that they had safe water sources earlier, which was lost, which was damaged because of different disasters, because of climate-induced disasters and events. So it's clear loss and damage. So that actually our first learning from the ground when we started our planning. So key learning is here. For addressing loss and damage, we must know the community because the affected community knows the loss and damage the most. So the loss and damage actions will be perfect and practical if only we engage them in decision making. Now come forward to the specific actions, what we are doing on the ground. We have 3 key actions. First area is planned relocation and assisted migration. So we work on local level awareness development, especially on the migration piece, because there are a lot of issues in the whole process of climate-induced migration, and discussion on future alternative livelihood. That's especially at pre-decision stage, so that at least the vulnerable community, the migrants, can have at least an informed decision. Then we also support them through offering skill development opportunities. So at destination, at least they can go with a level of skill so that they can sustain and exist. And third activities, I would mention that supporting them through provision of ideas and options on the use of remittances, because in most cases, the families are left behind in that climate vulnerable context so that they can utilize it for climate resilient economic and livelihood activity. again for the existence. I'm not talking a lot about development or sustainability. And third one, we support the information provisions at local level, at union position we call the last tier of local government, so that they can be influenced for the social safety net programs and others. And ultimately bringing these data and information at national level or global level to influence the policymakers. Okay. Second bit, that key activity is reskilling and support for rebuilding livelihoods, not necessarily developing or improving livelihoods. Mention the words, and please focus it, that reskilling and support for rebuilding livelihoods. So here we always try to train and capacity development of the people, especially on the common livelihood interest for the producers group, mainly the agricultural sector. And when I say agriculture, it includes crops, fisheries, livestock, poultry, everything, and to some extent forestry as well. And we also support them through resource mobilization for demonstration plot, for example, seed bank and homestead gardening like that. And third key area is rebuilding damaged infrastructure. And under this actually is work through a model grant, especially for the inclusive access of the most affected communities. And we follow actually co-financing mechanism with the local government institutes. And we also support in maintaining and establishing collective options of facilities on the context. For example, local infrastructure, roads, culverts, bridges, say pond waters and filters, and surface water reserve facilities. Now let me bring just one of the cases for each key areas, the examples, and what is our key learnings, so you understand what we are doing and what actually should fit in the loss and damage actions. First one, on the planned relocation or assisted migration, you can see a photograph. This is actually Helal. You'll meet him in Bagarhat districts if you visit somewhere in Bangladesh in any case. So currently he actually provides services as an electrician and fixing cell phones. Let's know about his family. His family was uprooted and displaced several times. I say again, several times after Cyclone Cedar in 2007 and Cyclone Ayla in 2009. So his father and his family, having lost home, agricultural land, livestock, and source of income, actually his father tried with different alternative options, alternative opportunities such as pulling rickshaw or daily unskilled labor. And he also tried actually generating income at local level, even taking the loans from the NGOs, which actually left them trapped in debt. And ultimately, he had no choice but to migrate, leaving the family struggling in home that continued to flood every full and new moon, as I mentioned earlier. But Helal did not actually want to migrate as his father had. So what was the solution? So where actually our project contributed him? We supported him through capacity building, where he received training in his skills of choice. I mention again, his skills of choice through our loss and damage actions. So supported actually both migrant and non-migrant people in the context with the skill training through apprenticeship model, as I mentioned, and link them with the mentors and employment opportunities. So what is our learning here? Simply addressing loss and damage means ensuring affected people have the dignity of choice. As I mentioned, the support was for Masoom what he would like to do. And again, addressing loss and damage means supporting the choices so that they can be successful in their livelihood and income generating options over time. And our second learning, as I mentioned, actually, there are people, not necessarily all the people are migrating. So there are migration dynamics on one side. On other side, there are non-migration dynamics who has aspiration to stay, but probably different level of capability to stay. And the most vulnerable people, which we often say the trapped people. So addressing loss and damage for the trapped people means addressing their immediate and basic needs, so they can at least exist, and also make them informed about their rights so that at least they can sustain in the context and in the community. Now let's move to the second area. As I mentioned about reskilling and support for rebuilding livelihoods. That's again another case actually from Morelganj in Bagarhat, the southern districts. We supported a community through a cooperative model to rebuild their livelihoods. You can see the ground here. This is actually fallow land, which earlier was a cultivable land, changed because of continuous tidal surge, saline intrusion, and again an adaptation effort by the community for shrimp cultivation. Please note that word, that adaptation effort through shrimp cultivation. So in the whole process, what happened, they lost actually all the opportunities in the areas of agriculture and the classical or traditional livelihood skills they had. So in discussion and in detail analysis, in some sort of adaptation, how I don't know, actually the academician might frame it as a maladaptation as well, which worsened the loss and damage scenario further, making it poor. So our learning is that the poor loss and damage response even can lead to the future maladaptation as well. So what we did there, actually supported the community, as I said, through a cooperative model, through skill development, through alternative varieties and technologies, and linking them to the market system so that they can have access to their products on the ground. So it ensured actually for the families, for both their food security and livelihood opportunities, securing good earning for their families for 6 to 7 months. So mind the period here. It's not necessarily for the whole year. It's actually for 6 to 7 months. So this is great that their livelihood has rebuilt, but it does not secure them for all the year round. So two specific learning again. First one, when we look about or talk about the loss and damage actions, this must factor in climate impact scenarios so that it avoids actually creating further risk for the people. And as you see, that loss and damage response actually contributes to the adaptation, reducing the vulnerability, as well as building the resilience of the community. So it is not isolated something. So we must look at that bigger contribution as well from the loss and damage actions. Second learning, as I mentioned about their current security of food or income for 6 to 7 months, so addressing loss and damage, it's not a one and done activity. So the community needs more, you understand from the example. So the loss and damage funding also needs to allow for an evaluation of priorities over time. So that one-way message for the loss and damage actions. Now let's move to the third one. This is another story from Koira, Khulna, another southwestern districts in Bangladesh. So it supported the community here through reconstruction of a road, of a small community road, which was damaged in 2007 during Cyclone Cedar, then almost lost in 2009 during Cyclone Isla. So two back-to-back cyclones within 2 years. In that community, there are 247 households who were isolated entirely for almost 16 years. The last 1.5 decades. They lost access to education, they lost access to health, and they lost access to the basic needs and services. See, the complete violation of human rights, if we would like to frame. And over the period, think about the community. They buried their dead bodies in the courtyard or nearby as they had limited, very limited access to the community graveyard. So we have supported them through the LGIs, again following a co-financing model. And just a result, you know that Bangladesh is currently going through a festive mode. That's because of Durga Puja, the biggest religious event for the Hindu community. So this community got this religious festival back in their life after 16 years. So that's the impact. So what's the learning? Again, two key learning I would mention here. One is when you talk about addressing loss and damage, it actually should provide a scope or adopt a locally led and self-determined approach so that community can define, identify, and address it. And it is appropriate to promote the prism of human rights and human dignity. As I mentioned about complete violation of human rights of this community for last 16 years. So that's a very, very important element to bring in. And second learning, as we mentioned about, as Achola was also brought that example of economic and non-economic discussion, we have got it. So the conventional categorization of economic and non-economic loss and damage are sometimes limited actually to understand the life experience because it is correlated and co-contributing. As I mentioned in this story, we have supported them for economic loss and damage, just construction of a road, but see how much contribution it has brought and ensured in the frame of non-economic loss and damage. And as a whole, if I would like to stop here, so the community is dying on the ground, as I always say, and it is our shame that we are debating, we are negotiating, we are discussing, we are making dialogues about the funeral. This is completely inhuman being. It's completely inhumane, I say again. So the fund is must, fund is important. There is no more time to debate, no more time to discuss. So we must act on loss and damage actions. And second one, as I brought the examples of one of the funding, how we have responded from the community, that's actually came from a bilateral funding mechanism. It's not fair enough. We demand the fund for the community on the ground through the as a whole UNFP policy mechanism. So that's our demand from the ground. I'll stop here. Thank you all. Thanks for listening to me.
Thanks for the great presentation and sharing your experiences with us, Ashish. I see that Miss Florence is online from Vanuatu, but before we move on to her, I would just like to take a couple of questions from the Q&A. And I would like to address the first question to Mr. Aslam. Asia is a disaster-prone region, both climate and non-climate related disasters. What is the data telling you in terms of overall increase in disasters and L&D linked to climate in a more recent decade or year?
I mean, if you have followed the latest Asia Pacific disaster report, which has been launched last July, both in terms of the frequency and in terms of the impact, if not exponentially, but substantially, the increase in terms of the rise of various disasters that has been taking place over the period of time. The impact in terms of both into the economy as well as in the lives of the people as well has actually increased over the period of time. A lot of efforts are being done to look into the different type of vulnerabilities, and you saw some of the good examples, particularly from Ashish, what he mentioned. But I think it's still the gap of financing, and particularly the adaptive financing is very, very minimal at this moment in large part of the developing nations. So this is where the current scenario is.
Thank you. One question to Ashish. From your perspective, what are the most effective strategies for building community resilience in the face of recurrent loss and damage? And how can these approaches be integrated into broader development planning and policy frameworks?
Okay. Thank you, Shubhans, for sharing the question. So, see, as I have brought the examples from the community, this is the reality, okay? And this is a sad part, actually, when rather than addressing, rather than taking action, we in most cases talk about strategies, plans, okay, framework, okay, academic thoughts, okay? But well, as I said that the community is experiencing loss and damage each and every day. So the key point is actually how we are addressing the current situation, how we are reaching the community on the ground, okay? And here, if we talk about the strategy, I would say like from local level to global level, the key point where I see and what I would like to mention that our strategy or approaches, which you already have, we know that if we look in the framework of total development sector or humanitarian sector or climate change sectors, we have experienced that need-based approaches or the human rights-based approaches, which actually our program is built on now. But problem is that these are limited to some extent. And again, if I talk about the whole implementation of the strategies, the key point is actually what we are committed, we are not doing that. And why it is happening? Because in the whole system, whole framework, even if we refer about the UNFCCC mechanism, there are a lot of issues. There are unjust system. In most cases, we talk that it's a failure system. It's a broken system, right? So there are unjust systems which actually need to be radical, which must be addressed the root causes. It should be transformational and actually should be based on mutual benefit. Still, we are debating. Nusrat has shared about the latest updates from the transitional committee, right? We are trying to just transfer our liabilities and risk who will take the burden or not this way. So we must critically look at the unjust system. We, in most cases, go with unjust actions. When I must say that we should be aware of our actions. We should be responsible, and we must look at our behavioral changes as well. I mean, just actions or everyday activism. And the last one, I would say that there are a lot of unjust accountability. So there are a lot of discussion and stories about the adaptation fund, loss and damage fund, and we have big commitment of that 100 billion stories we know. But is there any accountability mechanism that if fund is not coming, if we go out of our commitment, what is done? Do we anyway, or in any case, there is any example that we're being accountable for our commitments? There is no, it's completely missing. So I must say that whole system, whole mechanism strategy should be based and emphasis on the brave accountability. It should be on ethical standard. There must be some enforcement mechanism. And also we must talk about ending the impunity. It's completely unfair. So as a whole, I would say that we must focus on the justice-based approach. Thanks, Shivan. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Ashish. I see that again, our speaker from Vanuatu is not online. Team, do you see her? Okay. Yes, okay. Then let's move on to our last speaker, who will provide the closing remarks for the session. And before that, I would like to show you my handphone. This is Samsung S10. It's fairly outdated. I think right now we have S23, something like that. And next year we'll have S24, and then we'll have 25, 26, and so on. One thing is clear, I probably will not be around for the launch of S82. I don't know, some years from now. But there will be one generation of people who will still be around, and that is the youth of our generation. And our inability to take action and to take decisions to address climate change will probably impact this generation the most. And here, representing the voice of youth for loss and damage, and also to close the session, I would like to invite Ms. Hae-ryong Choi, the 2023 Korean representative for the UNESCO Youth Forum on Climate Change, with experience in various organizations, despite at a very young age, including human rights NGO, UNESCO, UNHCR, and startups. She focuses her efforts and works in human rights and climate vulnerabilities.
Hi, everyone. Please allow me to break the tradition of going to the podium. I hope you can see me. I'm tall enough. Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Hae-ryong Choi, and today I'll be discussing loss and damage from a youth perspective. Oh, can I have a remote controller, please? Just to briefly introduce myself, is actually quite self-explanatory, and Shivan has introduced me, but I'm representing Korea to this year's UNESCO Youth Forum on Climate Change and Equitable Transition, and I'm also working as a loss and damage consultant at GGGI. Here's the brief overview of the presentation, but I think I'll adjust some contents to secure all of your lunchtime. So I'd like to begin with a personal story that led me to the field of climate change, as it's really closely related to today's topic. So back in 2006, I watched a Korean documentary about something called super typhoons. So I was 6 years old then, and I liked watching Pingu and Dora the Explorer, not documentaries. However, I couldn't turn away from the documentary because it was too terrifying to ignore. The documentary forecasted that in the distant future, South Korea will also explore the super typhoons of incomparable destructiveness with the increasing frequency due to the changing weather. Although I was frightened, I didn't feel like that is something that I'd experience very soon. And in 2013, during my middle school days, the Philippines was struck by one of the most powerful typhoons ever recorded. It reminded me of the childhood documentary, but still I didn't see it as a concern because after all, tropical regions have faced numerous typhoons every year, and South Korea has never experienced such a catastrophe. So I dismissed it again as unrelated to me. So you can see the pictures of Seoul Gangnam Station when it was flooded due to the heavy torrential downpours caused in 2022, which was just a year ago. And this time I felt something was different because my friend and I barely made it home safely. And the district that you can see in this picture is a short walk from my home. So around this time, I could feel that the news media began talking about the climate change actively, linking this problem to the city's insufficient flood control capacity. And from this personal journey, I've learned two lessons. First, climate-induced loss and damage can seem distant until you experience it firsthand. And second, I've come to understand why younger people and younger generations are more active in demanding climate action. As Dr. Achala showed us, the loss and damages include the loss of income, physical assets, human life, health, territory, and biodiversity. So it's a matter of survival. And we, the youth, have a higher likelihood of suffering these losses, losing the loved ones, and requiring more effort to recover. And some losses are even irreversible, or they demand significant amount of time and resources for recovery. But contrasting the challenging current state, here are some realities I've observed as both a youth and a professional in this field. So first, youth have limited influence in decision-making process. Despite decisions affecting our lives, our voices are often not heard effectively. So there's a lack of mechanisms to ensure that young people's perspectives reach the decision makers and inform various national policies that impact youth at the local level. This is very closely related to the second one, which I really want to talk about, that youth are often treated as subjects rather than agents of change. While people commonly say that youth are the leaders of the future, many still consider the youth as young and inexperienced. Ironically, thirdly, youth are expected to provide some innovative solutions without the necessary support. While their fresh perspectives are praised, there is a high demand for their ideas, yet resources and fundings for the youth-led projects and capacity building programs are insufficient and less accessible. And lastly, the term youth is sometimes used merely to create a superficial appearance of diversity. So some use the label youth without a genuine commitment to involve or represent the young people in decision-making processes or actions. So in such cases, the use of the term youth lacks depth and meaningful engagement. Sorry if this is not the updated version of the presentation file, but please ignore the last one. In a more personal tone, I'd like to share how loss and damage has affected and it will continue to affect my life without any exaggerations. So firstly, my deep concern about the climate impacts led me to apply for my current position. And I currently live with my family and adorable cat, but I'm not sure if I'll have children or pets when I marry in the future, because I worry about the safety of the climate environment. And I don't want to bring more loved ones into a world where the chances of losing them are increasing. So while some extent of worry and anger do motivate me, the real impact of eco-anxiety on mental health cannot be overstated. I believe that many young people are experiencing the same anxiety, and several youth networks focus on addressing it as one of the most important goals. Some even offer some activities like dancing sessions to help alleviate the anxiety. And the severe weather with hotter summers and colder winters threatens our health, and more contagious diseases are becoming increasingly common. In the future, loss and damage will likely disrupt local economies and job markets, and extreme weather events will damage my property, resulting in financial strain. In a few decades, I expect potential migration and displacement, and I also anticipate the loss of cultural traditions and heritage during my lifetime. Health impacts, needless to say, will increase as I grow older. So I actually wanted to touch upon some discussions on loss and damage during the preparation process of the UNESCO Youth Forum happening in this November, but I will just keep it very simple. So we are having a regional meeting every week, and I belong to the Asia Pacific region. And these are the 4 themes that we believe are worth touching upon. To make a linkage with the loss and damage, we emphasize the need to provide youth with tools, trainings, and mentorship to lead the climate action, especially concerning loss and damage because it's a climate emergency. And we agree that some IOs and UN agencies view that hosting youth forums or merely involving 1 to 2 youth delegates as the most easy and quick way to engage with young people without any substantial contents. We also addressed the accessibility to green jobs and addressing the psychological impacts, as I mentioned before, and reducing the stigma around the mental health issues. So what unique roles can youth play in addressing loss and damage? Here are 2 ideas. First, youth can continuously sound the alarm for more climate actions driven by their passion and anxiety. They can amplify the demand for action at grassroots, national and international levels. To be specific, it is relatively easy for the IOs and the governments to plan on the L&D activities and projects, but continuing them is up to the ongoing willingness and the budgets. So youth can keep echoing the importance of addressing the loss and damage and monitor the older generations to ensure that they fulfill their pledges. Secondly, youth value the aspects of climate justice because it's a matter of survival for them, given the uncertainties of the future. I think this shared climate empathy sets them apart from previous generations, and fairness and equity in international climate negotiations makes it sometimes challenging, particularly when wealthier nations seek to avoid liability and responsibility. But I think the youth are actively championing the climate justice, which is a unique and essential function of their generation in the global dialogue. For instance, the YouthNet Global, a climate advocacy organization, recently criticized the World Bank's involvement in the Loss and Damage Fund to maintain impartiality and prevent biases right after the recent meeting of Transitional Committee. So as such, I would like to emphasize that the youth engagement in addressing loss and damage, sometimes regarded as an option, but I believe that it is a necessity. So we are the generation that will face the consequences of climate change, and we possess the energy and determination to drive change. As a closing remark, I hope that at the institutional level, GGGI contributes to creating the enabling environment for the youth, and I hope it somewhat provokes the message of youth. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiriong, for the very touching message. I promise that we will do our best to make sure that youth is not treated as a category to tick the social inclusiveness, but we'll do our best to ensure that we will include you as part of the decision makers as well. We have answered some questions earlier. Some speakers are already answering questions in the chat as well. I see that it's 12:00. If anyone has any question, just one addressing to any speakers, we can maybe take a quick one. If not, I would suggest we close the session. We can write additional questions in the chat. You can also still write questions to me or directly to any of the speakers. I believe all the slides will be made available online. Yes, okay, then let's do so. Thank you for joining the session. Thank you very much for the speakers for preparing, Mr. Aslam, especially for attending the session in person from Thailand. Thank you to Ashish and our colleague from ICAD for joining in a very such notice, replacing Professor Salimul Huq. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the events planned for Global Green Growth Week 2023. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.